My name is Dacia. I use she, her pronouns. I am a pale, easily sunburned, plus size woman in my 70s. If I'm awake, I'm wearing glasses. And today I am wearing a pale pink polo shirt, a watermelon pin in celebration of August and in memory of my Aunt Ruth and Uncle Vernon. I've titled today's message, The Words We Choose. And developing it became something of an unexpected personal journey. I have, on some levels, been aware of this journey, but I lacked a full appreciation and even understanding. In the August meeting of the Date with Death Club, we talked about Parker Palmer's idea called third things. A third thing is something, most likely a realization, that emerges when thinking about, looking at, or doing other things. The idea functions not just in spiritual exploration, but also in daily life. Often when trying to remember something or make a decision, we shift our attention and move on and do something else. Excuse me. And while we are engaged in that something else, we also, in the back of our minds, are cogitating, thinking about, trying to remember whatever the original puzzle was. And voila, we get a new idea or remember where to find something. Encountering again that Thoreau reading on being deliberate acted as something of a third thing for me. First, I should say that I have generally felt at least a little bit intimidated by the purest passions of Thoreau. I'm not at all sure that my life choices add up to deliberate. So imagine my surprise while writing this message to discover that, in fact, there is an aspect of my life in which I have been very deliberate, maybe even Thoreau level deliberate. I heard an echo. Is the sound a problem?
We're good.
Okay. There are many threads in this story, which I now notice led me to a certain level of deliberate. And I'm going to attempt a chronological telling. As a child, my parents were very protective. They didn't want me to get hurt. And after getting stung by a bee while running barefoot one summer, I always wore shoes. I don't recall that this was an imposed restriction. I believe that I opted to wear shoes to avoid future stings. Obviously, only my feet were protected. I didn't fully understand how strong the don't get hurt message was until hiking with friends in my early 20s. I realized that I was especially cautious, much more cautious than any of my companions, all of whom were uninjured. In fact, I was, at least some of the time, putting myself at greater risk through caution. Pondering this reality, I began to hear a loving chorus of don't get hurt, 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 looping endlessly through my mind. My parents' voices echoing through my head and my life. It didn't actually qualify as a critical voice because it was so loving, but it did create limitations. Continuing the hike, I debated these realizations in my head, in my heart. I still wanted to honor my parents, but I could see that those particular words were not helpful. If those words, don't get hurt, weren't helpful, were there other words that would be helpful? And as the hike continued to its end, I decided to shift the words to be careful. And the surprising thing was that the results of making that shift were almost immediate. I relaxed into the end of the hike. I didn't take risks, and I didn't get so much as a scratch. What I got was exercise with good friends and an internal sense of relaxation and confidence that was new to me. This was my first conscious interaction with the word don't in my mind. And I considered don't as the title for today's message. Those internal musings were not, of course, my first experience with the word don't. I actually have some recollection of learning about contractions in school. 3rd grade, maybe. I remember feeling more grown up and in the know. It was like getting keys to a secret code. Contractions, for those of us who are just beginning to learn these things, are a way of taking 2 words and turning them into 1 word. Words like can and not become can't. Will and not become won't. And do and not become don't. A decade or so after that hike, and truly after a certain age, one does begin to recall life events in relationship to decades. Anyway, in the late 80s, I took a course on hypnosis. In my memory, one of the sessions focused on contractions, do, don't, can't, won't, and especially it focused on the word don't. The facilitators, Richard and Elizabeth, explained that while contractions are linguistically useful, they have drawbacks that I'd never imagined. They said, don't think of a pink elephant. Try it. Don't think of a pink elephant. First, you have to create an image of a pink elephant. And then what? Somehow you have to block that image. You have to implement the negative. Maybe by enclosing it in a large red circle and then putting that bright red slash through the image. Or as I tried to do, I used a large imaginary eraser to try and clear my mind of the pink elephant. It was more or less manageable. Next, they said, don't think of chocolate cake. Try it. Don't think of chocolate cake. I'll bet every one of us has conjured up a delicious image of chocolate cake, with or without frosting. And then what? Did it work to put a big red circle around it and then that slash? Maybe you can still see just enough of the chocolate cake, that delicious chocolate cake, to keep thinking about it, despite your efforts not to think about it. In general, it's easier to X out the pink elephant than the chocolate cake. I was surprised by these examples, but felt relatively satisfied with my efforts to put them out of my mind, which in retrospect was probably more about willpower, like not thinking of, than actually clearing my mind. And such changes of thinking seemed fairly normal to me and not particularly onerous, just a fact of life. Then the instructors, Elizabeth and Richard, explained that don't is an especially difficult concept for children. You need a certain level of cognitive development to be able to process don't. I admired and respected the instructors, yet I must confess that though I left the session better informed, I was definitely somewhat skeptical. A few days later, I was visiting friends, 4 children between the ages of 10 and 3 or 4. At some point, all of us but 3-year-old Oliver were in the dining room, while Oliver was on a step stool at the kitchen sink playing at washing dishes. He had a dish towel in one hand, and first one sibling and then another said, "Oliver, don't get the towel wet." Eventually, there was a repeating chorus of family, all exclaiming, "Ollie, don't get the towel wet. Ollie, don't get the towel wet. Ollie, don't get the towel wet." Now, I'm watching this and remembering that class about don't, and think to myself, well, if the theory holds, he's going to get the towel wet. And sure enough, Oliver got the towel wet. The family chorus of "don't get the towel wet" were all disappointed and genuinely surprised that Oliver got the towel wet. For me, a light bulb went off. He couldn't process the don't, because the don't caused a focus on getting the towel wet. Definitely something to ponder. The very next week, On a finally sunny day when the snow was turning to a salty, dirty mess, I was sitting in my car waiting in a parking lot. And the grandmother and young child began getting into the car next to me. The grandmother says lovingly but very earnestly, "Don't get your boots on the seat." And she keeps repeating this phrase, "Don't get your boots on the seat. Don't get your boots on the seat," as she is helping the child into the car. And yep, I'm sitting there thinking that this is not going to turn out well. And sure enough, I hear the grandmother's somewhat raised and very irritated voice proclaiming, "You got your boots on the seat. I told you not to do that." The child's barely audible reply indicated confusion because that child couldn't process the don't and obediently got their boots on the seat, an act which I imagined at the time might actually have been somewhat awkward. With that observation, the light bulb turned into a floodlight. Children cannot process the contraction don't, at least not when it comes to behavior. Now I turned that light, those flashes of insight, towards myself. How do I use the word don't? Not very much, I'm sure. But upon very little self-observation, I discovered that I actually made fairly frequent use of don't phrases. Our daughter, Naomi, was somewhere between 8 and 10 at the time, and I decided to stop using don't with her. We went through weeks of me starting to tell her some kind of don't something, and then stopping mid-sentence for a occasionally rather long pause while I figured out a phrase that did not use the word don't. I came up with things like have enough fun, keep your bones whole, be safe. I know that there were other phrases, but these phrases became my frequently used words of farewell when she was leaving for school or another activity. And when she began driving, I added drive safe to all of my farewells. Psychologists and educators call this adding a positive frame. It keeps the focus on what you want as opposed to focusing on what is to be avoided. To jump for just a minute to the very near present, just last week, I was telling Naomi that I was working on this message, and I was surprised to hear that she remembers this phrase of her childhood. Not only does she remember, but she actively implements similar phrasing with the students in her college classes. I was touched. But now returning back to my original exploration of don't, having worked in outpatient alcohol clinics, it didn't take me very long to realize that in addition to children, drunks cannot process don't. The "Don't Drive Drunk" slogan is, in my not particularly humble opinion, practically an invitation. Drive sober would be a much more effective message. Over the years, I have continued to notice the use of don't and continue to strive to avoid using it myself. And I considered titling this message, Don't. When Laura Parsons asked me if I'd be willing to share a message this summer, she wondered if I would also like to choose the hymns and readings. I leapt up the opportunity and picked the hymns almost immediately, which I realized later was effectively calling dibs for the summer. I picked today's opening hymn, Enter, Rejoice, and Come In, because of the strong positive wording. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. I've loved this hymn since the first time I heard it in the 90s. Imagine then my chagrin when I realized that the fourth verse includes the word don't. Don't be afraid of some change, on repeat. This set me to imagining other wordings like reach out and embrace some change, do warmly welcome change, carefully accept some change, hopefully do explore change, happily accept some change. reach out and explore some change. Anything instead of saying don't. Once you start to pay attention, examples of don't abound. There are many current examples of the challenge using the words don't. Think about YouTube. How often does the speaker on YouTube conclude with something like, don't forget to subscribe? And then there are signs, don't text and drive. There's a recent story circulating about don't give up the ship. And there's always the don't forget your keys, don't forget to say thank you. Over the next days and weeks, I imagine that you will become more aware of don't. As you listen to the news, you will likely hear uses of the word don't in intense situations. Clearly, there is more to unpack about don't. But I am going to return to Thoreau. Eventually, Thoreau became less intimidating for me because I learned that even Thoreau wasn't as ascetic as his writing sounded. While living on Walden Pond, he had dinner at least once a week with the Emersons, and he carried leftovers back to his cabin, and he took his laundry to Mrs. Emerson. I needed to learn or remember that real life will interact with our thoughts regardless of what we write. Still, it turns out that without realizing, I have for many years sincerely held a very deliberate, a Thoreau-level deliberate focus on the word, on word choice, especially about don't. The more often I or we are thoughtful about the words we choose, the less often we have to try and return the toothpaste to the tube. And I appreciated some of the other suggestions for solutions. Share the toothpaste, wash it off. I hadn't thought of those. Do I always succeed? Not yet. Do I keep working on it? Yes. If you have ever been critical of yourself or others because you or they violated a don't do something or other statement or expectation, it is possible that you could get better results for yourself, at least, by shifting your word choice away from don't into a positive frame. Think of a cantaloupe, corn on the cob, tomatoes. Remember your keys. Be sure to say thank you. Keep your boots off the seat. Keep the towel dry. Upon reflection, I conclude that the words we choose are closely related to implementation of our first principle, the first principle of Unitarian Universalism, to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Choosing to exercise extra attention with our wording so that it is most supportive of the listener is an act of courtesy, respect, and love. And it aligns with the UUA's ongoing Article 2 project, which proposes that love, active love, be the center of our expression and experience of Unitarian Universalism. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.